if Michigan has a shot to win in this game, it's going to be that way. They're going to have to try and stop the run, force some turnovers, and then kind of play keep away. Because Michigan's offense, it's weird because their offense I thought got better as the season went on, but it's still one of the worst in the country. So if Michigan has a shot to win this game, it's to be on the defensive side of the ball. It's going to come with turnovers and just making Alabama uncomfortable.
Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports, inspired by football legend Joe Namath. Embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in a new app coming soon. Hey, welcome to Beat Everyone. I am Ben Flanagan with AL.com, and we are now just a couple of weeks away from the rematch of the last college football playoff semifinal, the Rose Bowl instant classic between Alabama and Michigan that went to overtime. Michigan beats Alabama after stopping Jalen Milroe on 4th and goal, and the Wolverines go on to win the national championship. And now these classic programs will battle it out once again in less than a whole calendar year, no less, in the internationally beloved and definitely well-known ReliaQuest Bowl, where both of these storied teams wanted to be a year after their last game. And helping us to break it down, chief beat writer covering the University of Michigan football program for MLive Media Group over at MLive.com, Aaron McMann. Welcome. Thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks for having me, Ben.
Hey, Aaron. So these are two blue bloods in college football. Obviously, the Rose Bowl really was the perfect setting for what was a true helmet game, as people call them. I mean, there's history between these programs. We're going to get into that a little bit, but I think the real question that our audience wants to know, or the question that they have is this: what do Michigan fans really think of Alabama?
I think they look at them as probably the measuring stick in college football. There's always these crown jewel programs you could say of, to measure yourself up against. I think they view Alabama that way, especially going into last year, right? I think there's this feeling among Michigan fans that they were going to finally get to a national championship. They've got to beat some of the SEC powers, and Alabama was one of them. Alabama, Georgia, et cetera, et cetera. So they view them in high regard, mutual respect. I mean, when you win a lot, I think you garner that across the country. And, I think that's certainly, the case here in Ann Arbor.
Yeah, I think there's mutual respect, right? Growing up, I was very well aware of the Michigan football program. They were storied. They were widely respected in Alabama as a national power, especially historically. There was Alabama, there was Notre Dame, there were these programs. Michigan was always on that short list of teams and programs that you would talk about. But, I wonder about that game specifically. I mentioned that Rose Bowl, right? Like, what did beating Alabama mean to that fan base? How do fans feel about that win, and how do you think they're going to always feel about it?
Yeah, it was a breakthrough moment, I think. Up until that point, Michigan had gotten to the playoff twice. They hadn't been able to break the glass ceiling, so to speak. And that was, I think, it for them. You still talk to some Michigan players and even fans who were at that game, that Rose Bowl game last year. Some of them hold that win in higher regard than the national championship. A, because it was Alabama, and B, it was the Rose Bowl, the setting, the mystique, everything that kind of goes along with it. So no, it was a huge moment for the program. I mean, they'd gotten the playoff 2 years prior to that, hadn't been able to win either their semifinal matchup. So that was a big moment for them to not only win a high-profile bowl game, but then catapult themselves into the national championship like they did.
Yeah, there are times, especially in the SEC, where if you win the SEC championship, then all likelihood you're going to win the BCS championship, say years ago. I think that's true for semifinal games a lot of the time, especially if it's a tough matchup like that, where it's like if Michigan or Alabama wins this game, then more likely one of these teams is going to be the national champion. And it certainly felt that way, especially after Washington beat Texas. Michigan goes on to just essentially whip Washington in the national championship convincingly. But, I said these teams have history, right? Like, they've actually, correct me if I'm wrong, have only played 6 times ever, and it's a dead even split, right? 3-3. This is kind of a rubber match this year. Michigan won the most recent matchup, as I said, but, what are your general thoughts on this series between the two programs? I mean, what's the first thing that maybe you think about when I say Alabama versus Michigan? I mean, something tells me that there's a little recency bias here, and for good reason.
Yeah, I mean, not only the 3-3, but this will now be the third matchup in Tampa, Florida, at a bowl game. So, they goes back a ways now. I think, yeah, if you ask most Michigan fans, they're going to point to the Rose Bowl win last year is kind of that marquee victory, as we were talking about. But I think it's interesting for these postseason bowl games is an opportunity to see some of these matchups that you normally wouldn't see, whether it's a regular season or even sometimes even the postseason. So I think there's some intrigue in that regard. And we talked about the Rose Bowl last year, but don't forget these two teams also squared off in the Citrus Bowl just a few years back as well, pre-COVID. So they haven't played a ton, as you pointed out, but they have played it seems more recent than normal, I guess, among two powers and in different conferences. So for me, when I think of Michigan, Alabama, I think forever it's going to be the Rose Bowl last year. I've only had the fortunate to cover two of these Michigan Alabama games, but certainly last year's Rose Bowl game, just the setting, the stakes that were in place, just everything that went into it.
Aaron, make no mistake, we all know where we were for the Mac Jones coming out party in 2019 in that Citrus Bowl, right? I mean, I think you do, and you're well aware of that. But now listen, I mean, there have been great games. The first thing I honestly think of, like, yes, 2012, Alabama has a great win to open the season against Michigan, and then 2019, it's a really good game for a half, and then Alabama kind of runs away with it in the second half. I'll be honest with you though, like the thing that's like imprinted on my brain is the 99 or 2000 Orange Bowl when Alabama loses to Michigan on a missed extra point. And that was just a devastating loss for a lot of reasons for Alabama fans, because, I mean, they're 7 years removed from a national title. They've seen some pretty low points in the last couple of years, and they finally have a strong season, win the SEC, make it to the Orange Bowl, get a classic matchup against a team like Michigan, and it's a hell of a game. I think Alabama was even up a couple of possessions at various points in that game. They let Michigan back in it. I forget who was playing quarterback for Michigan at the time, but he engineered, an impressive comeback, and then Alabama just Ryan Flugner was the name of the kicker. I'm sure Michigan fans remember it just as well as Alabama fans do. But yeah, Tom Brady, obviously. Nobody knew who he was at the time or that he would be Tom Brady. But yeah, one of the great notches in his college football belt, to say the least. So that's what I think of. And it's, not traumatizing or anything, Aaron. Jim Harbaugh finally delivered last year. And in Michigan, they win it all. They reached the mountaintop again for the first time since the late 90s. And then, Harbaugh bolts for the NFL. Certainly not an unexpected outcome, but I do wonder, what is the general feeling among fans about Sharon Moore and putting up a 7-5 record right after winning a national championship? I mean, I assume beating Ohio State probably makes it go down a little smoother, but how are fans feeling about this past season?
Yeah, you kind of hit the nail on the head. Expectations coming into the year, I think, were still high. If you listen to Sharon Moore and some of the coaches, and even the players talk last summer, they still expected championships. They still wanted to compete for the Big Ten title. They wanted to get back into the expanded playoff, and it didn't happen. So I think in that regard, it was a disappointment. To come in off 3 straight playoff appearances and national championship, and to go 7-5 and have to win your final 2 games in the regular season to do so, it was. But as you pointed out, they did beat their 2 rivals. They beat Michigan State, and then they finished the year beating Ohio State, what I thought was an absolute stunner in Columbus. So it does help. I think it gives them a little bit momentum going the offseason. And I think it gets some of the, maybe some of the critics that were, on Sharon Moore in the middle of the year, gets them off his back a little bit, gives him, some more time, buys him maybe another year here. But no, it was a disappointment. I think in any way you can measure it. It's just now a matter of whether they can build on that and improve next year. And that starts, I think, with this ReliaQuest Bowl on December 31st, to try and find some momentum going into the offseason.
Yeah, let's talk about ReliaQuest here in just a minute, but I do have a follow-up about Sharon Moore. Like, what does the window look like for him? We've talked a lot on this show about Kalen DeBoer's expectation as a first-year head coach in Tuscaloosa at a program like this, and I'm sure the same is true for Michigan. But we talked about how every coach, they deserve a little bit of grace during that transition year. In DeBoer's case, with what he inherited, losing to Vanderbilt in Oklahoma, missing out on the playoff. You started to feel the walls close in a little bit during the season, especially during a first, even for a first year. But people seem open to giving him that grace now that the season is over. He had a strong recruiting class here in December. What about Michigan? Like, what does Sharon Moore need to do to reassure those fans that Michigan is still among the college football elite and will be for several years.
And I think it's a very similar situation to Kalen DeBoer in that, he's got some time. The Michigan administration certainly is going to give him, they're going to be patient with Sharon. We have to forget sometimes we forget he's a first-year head coach. He's in a way kind of still learning on the job, and he's got some maybe inexperienced staffers around him. So this first year, I think, was kind of learning on the job type moment, and it probably isn't what some Michigan fans want to hear. But look, it was reality. He's still figuring himself out. I mean, he hasn't even been the head guy now for a full 12 months. So he had to navigate the NIL waters, the transfer portal. He lost a lot of talent last year. And they lost some games maybe they should have won or at least been closer in. So, he's going to get some time. I think the one saving grace for him, at least in the immediate future, is recruiting. You point out Alabama recruiting well. Michigan has as well. They've got a top 10 class at this point. They've got the number one player in the country coming in next year and a 5-star quarterback. So there are pieces they can build around. Now it's about kind of filling that out and stockpiling the roster, because that was one of the reasons why Michigan had been so dominant the last couple of years in the Big Ten. Not only do they have good players on both sides of the ball, but they had depth at all these positions. And nowadays, in the transfer portal era and NIL, it's more difficult to build that depth. So I'm really curious to see where he goes. But shelf-wise, he's going to have some time. I don't see, Michigan's administration, at least, putting the pressure on him anytime soon.
Yeah, and non-playoff bowl games really put depth to the test, don't they, when it comes to opt-outs, when it comes to the transfer portal. And look, we put this off long enough, right? Let's talk ReliaQuest Bowl. I mean, these teams are going to square off at Raymond James Stadium in Tampa, 11 a.m. Central Time, I think, on December 31st. It's a rematch, yes, but the teams obviously look much different than they did earlier this year, starting with first-year head coaches on the sidelines. Alabama apparently won't have any significant opt-outs. I think that was a surprise to some people. Jalen Milroe has said he's playing. A lot of Alabama starters have emphasized they're playing in this game. They want to finish the season. What does Michigan need to do to win this game?
You mentioned opt-outs, and Michigan, I think, is going to have a bunch of them here. They already had a handful of guys, some of their top-level players, declare for the NFL draft. All-American defensive tackle Mason Graham, All-American cornerback Will Johnson, their top tight end Colson Loveland. Those are all potential first-round picks, and my indication, none of those guys are going to play. You throw in some of it. Michigan lost its top wide receiver to the transfer portal this offseason, Tyler Morris. And we're hearing there may be some other starters that may decide to sit out as well. So Michigan may be playing with, backups largely across the board on both sides of the ball. So it could be very interesting to see how Michigan fields this game and what they look like. Because, you talk about these rosters maybe being a little different than what we saw last year in the Rose Bowl. Fans may see that a totally different Michigan roster from what you saw in the regular season. So, it's going to be interesting to see. Michigan's strength, given all what I just said, their strength coming out of it, the regular season was their defense. One of the reasons why they were able to pull that upset off over Ohio State was because they were kind of able to muck it up and force some turnovers and just play some ugly football. And put Ohio State in some pressure situations. And I think if Michigan has a shot to win in this game, it's going to be that way. They're going to have to try and stop the run, force some turnovers, and then kind of play keep away. Because Michigan's offense, it's weird because their offense I thought got better as the season went on, but it's still one of the worst in the country. So if Michigan has a shot to win this game, it's to be on the defensive side of the ball. It's going to come with turnovers and just making Alabama uncomfortable. And I think that was one of the reasons why Michigan was able to stay close to beat Ohio State and stay close with the likes of Indiana.
Certainly the case with Alabama, too, in the Rose Bowl, right? I think it probably helps Michigan in some ways, even though they're going to be depleted from a personnel standpoint, but it probably helps that they're facing Jalen Milroe again. Yeah. They know what the kind of player Jalen Milroe is. We've talked about Jalen Milroe's development into year 2 as a starting quarterback, or lack thereof, in the eyes of a lot of his critics. But, do you think that playing Alabama earlier this year helps this team in any way? Are there players who will be playing in this game who played in the Rose Bowl and defended and confused Jalen Milroe and forced turnovers at various points in that game? Do you think that may even help Michigan in some ways?
Yeah, I think so. There will be a handful of guys on the defensive side of the ball, again, assuming they decide to step up, that they did play in that game last year. So they will have that, the knowledge, institutional knowledge, I guess you could call it. They have seen him on film, so they kind of know what he can do. They've gone up against it firsthand. They kind of, they prepared like this before. And look, Sherrone Moore was the offensive coordinator last year, so he's familiar with, some of Alabama's personnel as well. And Michigan's got a handful of coaches that were on the staff last year too. So I do think that helps. But again, if Michigan is so depleted with opt-outs, we'll see if it really makes a difference. It's one thing preparing for a guy with guys who played in the game last year and starters who play all season long. But it's different going up against someone with your second and third team guys that maybe don't have the skill set or maybe the experience of playing in a high level game like this. So I don't know. I'm curious to see how they match up with them because we saw Michigan did a good job kind of slowing them down last year, at least limiting some of the big plays. Will they be able to do that again this year? I don't know. I guess we're gonna have to see.
Yeah, no JJ McCarthy, right? You talk about somebody who, like, a lot of bend don't break, right? He got knocked around in that game. He took some vicious hits, but he just kept making one play after another. Big fourth down conversion on a touchdown drive to tie the game, send it to overtime. Blake Corum was obviously unbelievable in that game and all season for Michigan. So those are big losses, obviously, year to year. Michigan's one of those teams that can reload in a similar way to how Alabama has the last several years. But those are just difficult pieces to replace. So it's going to be a great game. I think, Alabama has a lot to prove in the eyes of a lot of fans. And I think that, whether they consider this like a revenge game, I don't know. The stakes are obviously not quite as high, but I think it's always good for college football when programs like this are on the field at the same time. So I'm really looking forward to it. The last thing I want from you, Aaron, here, I need a prediction. I don't want it on this game, though, okay? Because I know you've got a lot of reporting to do and coverage leading up to it. So you do that on your own time if that's what you guys do up there at MLive.com. But what I want a prediction on is the college football playoff. I mean, you got 4 Big Ten teams in the mix, including Michigan's arch rival, obviously Ohio State. They get another chance at this, even though you guys, I mean, Michigan just whacked them seemingly out of the picture, but apparently not. 3 SEC teams in the mix. Michigan and Alabama are out of the mix, but who do you like in the end in the first version of this 12-team format?
Yeah, when in situations like these, I think you've got to look at pathways and just the potential opponents. So I think in that regard, I'm looking at probably a Georgia-Texas final. I just think, top to bottom, I think ceiling-wise, I think Georgia has it. I think they're probably the best team in the country right now going into this thing. I know Alabama fans may disagree and whatever, but like they're a really good team, and I think the potential of facing a Notre Dame in the second round, and then whoever's a third, I think those two programs have the easiest pathway. So I'm going to go Georgia winning it all and Texas in the final.
That depresses me, Aaron, because that'll be that. I'd rather watch the Outback Bowl trilogy between Alabama and Michigan than the same season trilogy between Georgia and Texas. We've seen the result twice. We don't need to see it a third time. But I'm with you. I actually think that is probably the likeliest outcome at this point, that those teams make the final and we get version 3 of Georgia just beating them, this time with a backup quarterback. So not thrilled about that, but you're right. I think it's probable that we get them in the end. But I appreciate your candor, and we'll look forward to you being proven right by the end of that playoff, whenever it ends next year sometime. He is Aaron McMann, the chief beat writer covering Michigan football for MLive Media Group. Go read all of his work at MLive.com. Aaron, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. Happy holidays to you. You can find Beat Everyone on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, wherever you get your podcast. Subscribe, rate, review. Help us out. I'm Ben Flanagan. We'll see you next time. Beat Everyone is brought to you by Broadway Joe's Fantasy Sports, inspired by football legend Joe Namath. Embrace the thrill of daily fantasy sports like never before in a new app coming soon.